Hello everyone, thank you for joining us this morning to talk about Cyber Essentials and Vulnerability Management. Our presenter today is John Turner, Technical Services Manager at Sapphire. To cut down on background noise, your lines will be muted. If you do have any questions, then please send them across using the Q&A tool, and these will be answered at the end of the session. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Tina. Good morning all, and thanks for taking some time out of your busy day to allow us to go through this presentation. Today we're going to be looking at the use case of vulnerability management for Cyber Essentials Plus, and that use case will be us at Sapphire and how we've done it. We've successfully retained our Cyber Essentials Plus certificate for 4 years, and we've learned many things over the time, and today we're going to be discussing what we've learned from there and how vulnerability management can assist you with the Cyber Essentials Plus certification. So, a bit of an introduction. As well as the Technical Services Manager at Sapphire, I'm also the IT Manager. So I'm responsible for the internal network and therefore the Cyber Essentials Plus audit that comes in. If any of you are on the call and happen to know Sapphire, you may be thinking, well, John, that's actually quite easy because you're already a certifying body. But unfortunately, we can't mark our own homework. So just like you guys out there, I have an external auditor, which isn't internal, that comes and does this for us. So let's crack on and we'll go through the presentation and look at how this moves on. So, what is Cyber Essential Plus? Well, basically, you can break it down to 5 technical controls: secure configuration, user access control, malware protection, firewalls, and patch management. And basically, that's it. Although the audit is rigorous, the width is quite narrow with regard to what's actually checked. What we're going to do is we'll cover the first 3 fairly quickly, because as we'll see, this is something that most enterprise organizations out there will be doing anyway to some extent. Where the challenges are the last 2 items on this technical controls, and that's where we'll do a bit of a more deep dive and look at a use case as we go along. So, first one, secure configuration, the technical control. So what's the objective? Basically, just to ensure that your computer devices are properly configured to reduce the inherent vulnerabilities on there. So, what are the requirements? Well, with regard to what you're doing internally at this moment in time, this is all a single point of control that you can do for your whole network. So this is, probably something you're doing anyway. If you change all the default passwords, do you have a good AD or other password policies enforced? So it's something that most enterprise organizations can do, and also do from a centralized point that affects all your users. So pretty easy. You're probably doing that okay at the moment in time. Next one is user access control. So what's the objective? Well, in reality, this is, least privilege to be able to do your job. So user access control is all about users, how they access the system with the least privilege. Again, this is something that we probably implement and manage centrally. So, for example, not allowing your users to use their endpoint with full administration rights, as an example. And also having policies and controls for the addition, moving and deletion of those users' accounts. So again, probably what you're all doing, centrally managed, pretty easy to make sure everything's good to go for the Cyber Essentials Plus audit. Third one is malware protection. More specifically, we'll address the endpoint first. So this is all about, malware on your endpoint. So there are a few methods with regard to how we do that. Apologies, I just pressed the wrong button there, 2 seconds. Right, there we go. And it's all about, there's a few methods of achieving malware protection at the endpoint. For example, application whitelisting or application sandblasting. But to be honest, we, as probably most of you out there, address this with antivirus. So again, probably something that you're already doing. You've probably got a central AV system in there, like an enterprise solution, and being able to manage that centrally. So Cyber Essentials Plus, we're talking about, does all endpoints have antivirus? Are the definitions up to date every day? That type of thing. And again, something that an IT department centrally can control for the whole company. If we look at malware protection more specifically on the gateway, this is all about being able to do protection at the gateway, and again, something no doubt will be implemented in your organisation. So here we're more specifically looking at A/B protection on your mail filter and your web filter proxy. So in the Cyber Essentials Plus audit, they will be checking, if malware or executables can be downloaded from the internet and ran on the endpoint, either via a mail route or a web route. So again, having a centralized mail and web filter can assist in a central point, setting the rules for all staff and centrally managed. So again, it's probably something that we're all doing to some extent out there. Okay, so the firewalls, okay, now we're getting into a bit more of the fun, but basically this can be broken down into two sections. One is basically good firewall management, like changing default passwords, preventing access to the admin console to only those people who are authorized to do this, and good rule configuration. Again, for any enterprise organization, to be honest, this isn't rocket science and you'll be mainly doing this. However, there is that exposure of your firewall to the internet and managing those possibilities from there. So, for example, when's the last time you had a penetration test done? How do you know what your exposure is from the outside world looking at your firewalls? So we'll address this a bit more in detail when we get down to the vulnerability management, which is the main part of this presentation. Okay, patch management. Let's have a look at the objectives. Ensure that devices and software are not vulnerable to known security issues for which fixes are available. Fairly simple sentence, but we found in our experience, this is by far where most of the work is needed with regard to Cyber Essentials Plus. It's not only to identify what needs to be done, but also how to remediate those issues. So previous controls that we've been going through, we can see that they have been implemented from a single point of control within your organization. So the firewalls, the Active Directory, the web and mail filters, etc. So one change on there affects the whole of your network or the whole of your users, and therefore fairly easily managed. However, here we need to address every endpoint individually. So that's not bad in a very simple network with 10 or 20 devices, but what about if you're talking about hundreds of devices or even thousands of devices? So what we found is that having a mature vulnerability management program that we've been running for a while, embedded in, we found that invaluable, if not downright essential, to address this control. And it's something that we need to be able to understand, gather that information and act upon that information. So what is vulnerability management? Let's just clarify this so we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. So you might have heard the term vulnerability assessment or analysis opposed to the vulnerability management. So just to be clear here, a vulnerability assessment is just a snapshot. It's a collection of vulnerability data. And without any foresight or an end goal, what you're going to do with that, what are you going to do with that data? It's just a snapshot. Where when we talk about vulnerability management, we're talking about a program that will ensure that that data that is collected with other processes that may be tools or manual or whatever, ensure that the visibility, the remediation, the verification of those vulnerabilities is looped into a program which is a continuing cycle. So a VM is a program that collects data and uses processes throughout, but a vulnerability assessment, if you like, is just a snapshot. So it's important to define the differentiates that. So in a graphical way, when we look at a vulnerability assessment, we're looking to discover and assess. However, when we're talking about vulnerability management programs, we're looking to discover, assess, remediate, and then verify that remediation, and then looping back to the discover point in a continuing circle to be able to keep on top of those vulnerabilities that you discover. So we have some data from a vulnerability management vendor about those people who have purchased a vulnerability management tool and how are they doing it. So be aware that these are the people who have actually bought a tool and are attempting to use vulnerability management, opposed to those customers that aren't. But even when you buy the tool, a tool is just a tool, and if you don't incorporate that into a program, you're not getting the benefit out of that tool. So what they found when they analysed this, that is only 5% of the enterprise displays a high maturity of vulnerability management systems, and 33% of them actually are displaying a low maturity style. So when we're talking about maturity, maturity can be broken down into 3 sections. So one of the points about the maturity is how often do you scan? If you buy a vulnerability management tool and only scan once every 6 months, it's not doing its job. You are not on top of your vulnerability. So are you scanning on a weekly basis or a fortnightly basis? There's also that authentication coverage. So that's about being able to collect as much data as you possibly can on your endpoints to get the best visibility of that. So that meaning that we do authenticated scans opposed to non-authenticated scans. And also asset coverage, so ensuring that all assets are discovered and scanned. If you've got 1,000 endpoints and your tool is only scanning 500 assets, how can you incorporate that into your program and know what you're doing? We can't have black holes in your network in doing that. Now, using vulnerability tools, there is the scope of just looking at Cyber Essentials machines, i.e. machines that are in the scope of Cyber Essentials, or your whole network, and even viewing the whole network and splitting them out. But it's important to make sure in your maturity model that you are scanning all assets that are relevant to you. So why do people, even though they buy a vulnerability management tool, one of their common challenges, i.e. why aren't they succeeding? Well, there are a couple of challenges around implementing vulnerability management. Round identification, am I covering the whole network? Am I covering new machines that come in? Am I doing asset discovery? Do you understand the results? Have you got confidence in what's coming back? How are you doing that? If you've got a lot of remediation to do, how do you see the wood for the trees? How do you start and plan that remediation? And the biggest ones we see at Sapphire for our customers is, do you have the resource, the time, and the expertise inside your organization to do that? So even though those companies out there have actually purchased vulnerability management tools, some of these common challenges actually end up that they're not actually using that tool to its full extent. Okay, so after a bit of background, we can now jump into a case study, and that case study is us at Sapphire, and how we implemented vulnerability management program into our business as usual practice to assist us in our Cyber Essential Plus audit and certification. So let's have a look at the first part of vulnerability management program, which is the discover item. So we have a pretty standard network that's out there. We have a head office that has desktop and servers within there, protected by a firewall. We have remote sales offices where we have laptop users, and we also have those road warriors and remote workers that never come into an office and travel around the country. So first part of that discover is, how am I going to ensure that I'm covering everything I need to cover? So the first thing I'm going to do is stick a scanner on the outside in the cloud to be able to scan back and look at my firewalls coming back in. So that gives me confidence that I'm checking for vulnerabilities from the outside in. to make sure that there is no higher critical vulnerabilities in my network setup. And that is a part of the Cyber Essential Plus standard. And your Cyber Essential Plus auditor will be doing something very similar when you get to do that. So we can implement a cloud scanner to look at our outside-in vulnerabilities. I would also put a scanner within my head office. And that's there mainly to be able to discover those static machines and scan those static machines. So desktop servers, ones that we know where they are. If you're going to implement a DMZ, for example, and you're publishing stuff on the outside, we would drop scanners in there, or if you've got segregated networks, we can drop multiple scanners in there. But the whole idea of that is to drop a physical scanner within the network to be able to discover all those machines. However, I've got those, laptop users out and about, etc. So how do I deal with them? Well, we can put scanner agents on all of those machines to ensure that they don't even need to come back into the organization. They don't need a VPN back in. As long as they've got an internet connection at some point in time, they'll be able to scan their machines for vulnerabilities and report it to a centralized console. So with this setup, what I know that I've got is I'm discovering everything in my network. So my maturity level now is good because I've got no black holes in my network and I'm covering everything as a part of that. And those agents can be a part of my build process for new laptops. All the scanners are scanning everything, and I'm going to discover anything that's new in my network. Also, with regard to my maturity model, is I'm going to ensure that those scan policies happen once a week. So I know that I'm receiving all that information into a centralized single pane of glass on a weekly basis. So I'm getting no surprises as I move along from there. So we've got discovered covered. If we now go on to assess, now I'm fed all of that vulnerability data into a centralized console that now gives me the ability to assess where I am with regard to vulnerabilities for Cyber Essentials Plus. So I know what critical and high, medium and low vulnerabilities I've got there. I can also consume this data want to remediate that. So this is a way that we're assessing and also planning our remediation. So for example, I can consume this data by vulnerability. So let's say that a lot of my users use the Chrome browser and Chrome have just released a security update. So I can know from this that I've got 20 machines out there with a Chrome vulnerability. So I can use that to plan my remediation in a way that I will address that vulnerability on 20 machines. So I can look at and remediate based on vulnerabilities. I can also consume this data by asset. So that might be that I can assign a ticket to one of the IT guys and he can go and look at a single asset and address all the vulnerabilities on that single asset. So it's a matter of fact that we can play with this data, we can consume it in a way, and we can integrate it into our program in a way that we can consume that data by asset or vulnerability data and be able to plan our remediation. And what we found in our vulnerability management program, that little and often is far better than a big bang approach. So being able to run this program in a way that we're addressing vulnerabilities on a weekly or fortnightly basis and being able to keep on top of those vulnerabilities helps us enormously with regard to Cyber Essentials Plus, because we're not having to run around and do a lot of work. So little and often is far a better approach than we found in our organization, in our case study, than a big bang approach. So vulnerabilities data, they're in a tool, we're using that tool to assess and therefore plan. So then we need to go and remediate. Now, what is your patching policy? Do you need to pre-test patches if they're applicable to your network? Are you using tools to roll out patching across your network? What we find is, and we were the same as most organizations, probably have Microsoft ticked off there by using SCCM or WSUS or something along those lines to be able to patch. But are you also dealing with third-party patching? So how are you patching Adobe, Flash, Chrome browsers? Adobe readers, those type of third-party patching software, because third-party software, not just Microsoft, is a part of the Cyber Essentials Plus standard, and you will potentially fail if there's a critical vulnerability on your Adobe reader because it's 3 versions out of date. So how are you doing that? So there are tools out there that you can consider using from a centralized point of view that can push out Microsoft and third-party patching from a single point of view inside your organization. So we previously assessed, now we're pushing out and planning our remediation. Now we're actually doing our remediation, and we're using potentially tools to be able to do that. Nothing to say that you don't necessarily need a tool to do it, but you'll appreciate on large networks, a centralized tool in there is a great advantage to be able to push that out. We could stop there, but the whole point of the vulnerability management program now is to verify that that remediation that we've done has worked. Have we reduced our vulnerabilities? Have we seen those vulnerabilities that reported that we planned and remediated actually disappear? Hence now you can see the benefit of continually doing that maturity scanning on a weekly or fortnightly basis and to be able to prove that those remediations are going in there. A simple one is you may push a patch out to a server, but if that server is not rebooting, you haven't got rid of that vulnerability. So being able to verify that specific vulnerability that you have done has been remediated, we need that verification process. And that naturally loops back into the discover, because as you verify that you have mitigated those vulnerabilities previously, you obviously may well discover new vulnerabilities since the last time you've scanned. So that whole point of discover, assess, remediate, verify, back to discover, we found is essential within the vulnerability management program, is to keep that loop going around. So in summary, what have we learned? Well, we've probably learned that breaking down into the technical controls, the 5 technical controls with regard to Cyber Essentials Plus, you're probably doing some of those already, and you're probably doing them very, very well up to a Cyber Essentials Plus standard. There are probably parts of Cyber Essentials Plus that you probably have the tools and processes already in there. You just got to make sure that they are right and they're consistently and they're used correctly. So leave as process, start a process, your AD passwords. You've got all of these probably processes and tools. Just make sure that the verification of those that they're using. However, from our point of view, and what we found was that the vulnerability management side, moving away from a single centralized control and having to address every endpoint that is in scope, that's where we found that a vulnerability management system was, essential to be able to address that. And if you've got a number of endpoints, how do you know what you've got out there? How do you know what vulnerabilities there? The biggest thing about is if you don't know what you don't know, how do you address it? So consider a vulnerability management program if you have a significant number of endpoints to assist you to get to know all that, and have that patching plan, and make sure that you have a good patching plan that you do and follow on a regular basis. And don't forget it's not just Microsoft, it's all software under that standard. Well, thank you very much for your time on that. I hope that was of use. I'll hand you back to Tina to see if there are any questions.
Thanks, John. We have had a couple of questions in. The first is, you obviously use a vulnerability management tool internally. Which tool is it that you use?
Great question. Happy to let you all know that. We use Tenable products, and more specifically the Tenable IO product, which is the vulnerability management tool of our choice. That is a cloud SaaS system, so the management sits in the cloud, and that assists, if we remember the diagram of those things like agents, being able to talk directly to the cloud, but also gives you the ability to install scanners on your network. So, great question. Simple answer is we use Tenable.io.
Thanks, John. The next question, you mentioned machines in scope a few times. Can you explain what is in scope for Cyber Essentials Plus?
Again, great question. We get this asked all the time. In fact, prepping for that, I do have a slide. The reason I do is it's all about what is in scope and what is not in scope, and there is a certain amount of that scoping part of it which is down to you as a customer to define. But if you look at the scope essentially from Cyber Essentials Plus, it's established, the middle one of that one is established user-initiated outbound connections to devices via the internet. So therefore, every laptop and desktop that the user sits in front of is absolutely in scope. Your firewall is also in scope because that accepts incoming network connections, and the flow of data between the devices and the internet, so your mail filter or your proxy filter is also in scope. What that actually means is things like your Active Directory server in your rack, in your organization, is actually out of scope because a user is not sitting inside of that. However, I would like to point out that ourselves, as a part of our vulnerability management program, always looks at vulnerability for my whole network and then looks at the subset of machines that are in scope for Cyber Essentials Plus. So you can use those tools just as a Cyber Essential Plus. However, it makes a lot more sense to understand your vulnerabilities in the best network practice anyway to do that and look at your subset. But in essence, to your question, generally it's your firewall, your filtering technologies, but absolutely your endpoints are within scope.
Wonderful, thanks, John. Next question, just bear with me for a moment. We are part of the NHS, and our last pen test, most of it, and at our last pen test, most, if not all of our medical devices failed miserably. So we need to segment our network. Can you recommend a reasonably straightforward way of doing this, given that staffing and funding resources are extremely limited?
Yes, we could. I think we'd, Tina, if you don't mind taking that question for the user. I think that's a separate conversation for this presentation, but we'd be happy to take that on, get some technical and organise a one-to-one with that customer. We can certainly do that, and the vulnerability management program that we're talking about today is not necessarily talking about network segregation. So if you segregate your network, we can still check for vulnerabilities, but I think that's a separate technical discussion about that. But I'd really like to follow that up. Tina, if you can follow that information up, we'll get the account manager and we'll arrange a separate technical call on a one-to-one basis to address that.
Yeah, no problem. We'll take that offline. We'll get that answered after the session. The next question, John, do mobile devices, tablets, smartphones, etc., connecting to SaaS solutions come into scope?
Mobile devices are in scope if they hold company data within them. So the general answer to that is yes, because if you've got a mobile device, for example, you connected it up to ActiveSync, so you're receiving business emails, it is within scope of the Cyber Essentials Plus. So your vulnerability on that device absolutely is the same as any other endpoint. Is it fully updated to the correct operating system? Are all the applications on there fully up to date from doing that? In vulnerability management world, if you have MDM systems such as AirWatch or Mobile Iron or Mass 360 or one of those, the vulnerability management program, more specifically Tenable.io, can hook into those MDM systems and draw that data into your vulnerability management system to be able to identify if those phones are in scope, are they fully up to date and they don't have any vulnerabilities. So simple answer is yes. the more complex answer is it depends if they're holding company data.
Wonderful, thanks John. And I think this is the last question before we wrap up so that we keep time. If anyone does have any more questions, if you send them over using the Q&A tool, and we'll answer these later. So the last question, John, how does Cyber Essentials Plus stand on Java versions? This seems to be a massive stumbling block for a lot of people.
I completely agree. It's quite simply is if the vulnerability management program, Tenable, or any other vulnerability management tool that you decide to use identifies an out-of-date and unsecure Java version on a machine, and that machine is in scope, in essence, it's a fail. So we completely agree with that. I've understood that. I've dealt with customers where they can't update their Java because they're using legacy systems. That's when, right at the beginning of the presentation, when we said that it's a very narrow scope, Cyber Essential Plus, but it's rigorous. This is the rigorous of it. Is the simple answer to that is, unfortunately, you would fail with a vulnerable version of Java. So any old version of Java, you would need theoretically to update as a part of Cyber Essentials Plus. If that machine is in scope, I'll go on about scope more, but it's within scope. If it's an endpoint user and it's Java and it's out of date and it reports a critical vulnerability, in essence, that's a fail in Cyber Essentials Plus. Sounds unfair. Unfortunately, that's what the standard states.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, John. In order to keep to time, we're going to end the webinar now. If you do have any questions, I'll be sending you all an email following this session. So please feel free to respond and I'll ensure that John or one of the team gets back to you. A copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar will be made available to you too. And there is also a free trial of Tenable.io. If anybody's interested in receiving details about that, please let me know, or your Sapphire account manager. Great stuff. So John, thanks very much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you go on to have a great day. Thank you.